Hey Ryan, it's good to see you. So today we're thinking about ADHD and autism and considering it as a differential diagnosis and also a comorbidity to ADHD. And in my background in the NHS as an advanced nurse practitioner, I've done a whole bunch of ADHD assessments and supported with a lot of ASD assessments. But am I right in thinking that you're an autism practitioner and done a lot of neuropsych testing in your roles?
Yeah, so as a neuropsych tech at the University of Chicago, I worked with patients 2 through 25, did a lot of full neuropsych battery, so doing full developmental intelligence, academic memory, language. And with that, my provider that I worked with did an autism clinic. So every Tuesday we had specific ASD cases. I myself got ADOS certified, no longer ADOS certified. I haven't maintained that certification, but gone through the training and have done several ADOSs, but worked very closely with that population as well in that range, two through 25, typically younger.
Brilliant. So from age two toddlers, you're saying
Yes.
until yeah, early adulthood.
Yep.
And when we're thinking around ADHD and autism, with that age range, you're going to see kind of loads of differentiating symptoms, that sort of thing. Starting with the crux of the symptomology that we're looking for, um, I'm guessing in the States you're using the DSM-5 for
Correct.
your autism diagnoses. What are the key things that we're looking for in an
The
ASD diagnostic assessment?
The main things we're looking for with ASD is related to the social communication piece. So
Mhm.
it's the nonverbal cues that they're not picking up. It's the inability to switch tasks easily. We
Mhm.
also have some hyperactivity typed symptoms. We get the hand flapping, and when they get older, some of that stimming type behavior, the rocking front to back, things of that nature. But a lot of it, the crux of the ASD diagnosis, really falls on that social communication, right?
Yeah.
The inability to pick up on nonverbal cues, no longer social reciprocity, so they're
Mhm.
not communicating back and forth. You ask them a question, they'll go on and on and on, and if you go, well, I also, they'll go, okay, and then they'll keep going with it, right? They're not going to reciprocate that conversation. That's really one of the main areas that we're looking into when looking to diagnose ASD typed symptoms, and also looking at that pivotal age range of 3 to 7, right? That time frame when children are starting to learn all of these different types of social communications and understanding other people's emotions and how to reciprocate. That's where individuals with ASD, we start seeing some weaknesses to where they're not doing some of those things. So that's a very pivotal age that we're looking at, which was a big part of the clinic that I worked with as well. Um, how
And
about
did you see, sorry, go ahead.
I was saying, how is it? I work primarily with pediatrics. How is it for adults? I only had a handful of adults where seeing those symptoms in children to me was a little bit more obvious because it was
Yeah.
it was really easy to have those conversations and get with them. Whereas with adults, they start having coping skills where maybe they
Mm.
understand, I know I should be looking at Jessica's eyes. I know I should be right. So I'm gonna look.
Yeah.
How is your experience with adults compared to kind of what we would expect out of pediatrics?
That's a great question. And I think in my role, although my nursing background as a mental health nurse is focused primarily around CAMS, so children's mental health and pediatrics, I've ventured more into lifespan over the last few years and seen a number of adults come through my clinic where they're thinking around co-occurring needs or have had a referral for possible ADHD, and actually we're seeing other elements of neurodivergence instead. And you're right. So those who are coming to diagnoses later, whether it's ADHD or an autism spectrum condition, we see more of that kind of camouflaging or masking behaviors. It may be that people have had feedback throughout their
Hmm.
lifetime or have got terminology for themselves like, oh, a little bit quirky, or I've noticed that I do better with routines, or I prefer working in this environment, that sort of thing. Um, and sometimes people have, based on feedback that they've got, become quite aware of some of these social communication differences that you were talking about, which I imagine is different for young people. And as you said, possibly interjecting in conversation with have I given you the right amount of eye contact there? Or did I convey to you the right amount of emotion there? I know that I don't always do that. And so kind of thinking more um, around feedback that they've had in the past and then trying to bring that into conversation. Um, and I think it's interesting because I guess seeing it at a younger age, um, those learned social behaviors haven't come in just
Correct.
yet.
Yeah.
And I guess the kids have gone to in the US kindergarten and like on our side gone to nursery, and we're beginning to see the emergence of those behaviors, and we know that that also interplays quite heavily with ADHD as well. And I'd be super curious around what you've seen in clinic for those young people where ADHD and ASD sometimes overlap, or the question is this one or the other?
Yeah, and that's where the differentiate, the pulling them apart as two separate diagnoses, just one being present can be a little bit more difficult because we're looking to essentially rule out one. So if
Mhm,
we have someone who is more level one, so as you know with the DSM, there's three levels to ASD, level one, two, and three. One being high functioning language skills, doesn't really require a lot of assistance. Two, some support is needed, but they should be, right, able to kind of work and cope, as you said, as we give them these life skills and help them, they should be able to manage on their own, but they still need a little support. And level three being requires substantial support to be able to function within the day-to-day life. Those are also typically and coinciding with perhaps global developmental delays as well, because that's another thing that ASD is very comorbid with, is that pervasive developmental disorder that can also help lower their ability to understand social interactions, but also cognitive abilities.
mhm.
So if we're pulling apart and just ruling out, if we're leaning more towards ASD global developmental, it was almost easier because we can just say that most things are going to be attributed to this global developmental delay. The autism is part of that. ADHD could or could not be there, but this is so pervasive that it's more all-encompassing. Whereas
Yeah.
for our level ones, those individuals who have those language skills, to be able to differentiate ADHD really came down to drilling in, right? That's where the neuropsych assessments are really important in terms of getting the full picture.
Mhm.
When do we see these symptoms? When do we see these behaviors? If I'm talking with a child and they're talking about their fixated, right, goal, they really love dinosaurs. That's their fixation. That's where they're talking. They want to talk, all right? I can steer them away from that and have them complete a task, right? That's still that ASD. They're still trying to pull me back over. Whereas ADHD is more of that they're going to bounce. They may talk about dinosaurs, they may talk about something else. They're going to do the task, they're going to do this. Their inattention is kind of pulling them, or maybe their impulsivity is pulling them in multiple directions
Yeah.
during various tasks. So that's where differentiation is difficult because it does take a lot to be able to just kind of sit down and see how they function with different tasks. Physical, so manipulating blocks, right? Pictures, things like that. Auditory, so having them recite things, memorize things, so memory measures, right? How are they throughout all cognitive tasks, right? And then comparing that, where are these symptoms popping up? And then also
Mhm.
the time frame. Children with ASD, have always said myself, ASD can be a superpower. I've seen people with ASD persevere and just hammer through tasks because they become hyper fixated. Now that's not always a good thing, but they're able to tap into that. Whereas people with ADHD, we tend to see burnout, especially in pediatrics, right? You give them a memory measure and about 15, 20 minutes in, I'm done. They've hit that wall, right? Whereas the child with ASD may persevere, they may push through. So it's a little bit
Oh,
different that way, in terms of looking at that differentiation is
mhm.
when and where are the symptoms present.
And I've noticed, I think it was really interesting what you mentioned about developmental delay. Definitely in the UK in pediatric clinics, we can diagnose developmental delay up until age 8. And then we're thinking about, is this an intellectual disability from that point? And thinking about diagnosis of autism has changed a lot over the years. So my understanding is that up until 1992, it could only be diagnosed alongside an intellectual disability. And what's super interesting is that up until the change in the DSM in 2013, we couldn't diagnose alongside ADHD. And we know that it's up to kind of 70, 80% co-occurring need. And I'm just thinking about what you were saying there about teasing apart and pulling apart those symptoms, and the example you gave of the dinosaurs is what I've also seen in clinic is that sometimes referrals are coming through, possibly linking into we've got a child who's very hyperactive. And then when I'm seeing them in clinic, I'm noticing quite a lot of sensory needs. And I am aware that ADHD also comes with its own sensory needs, often a little bit texture based or around
Yep.
foods and that sort of thing. Um, but in autism and in autistic individuals, we often see these restricted and repetitive movements, don't we? And
Yep.
you mentioned rocking earlier. Do you think, oh, and you also mentioned hand flapping and some of those stimming and regulatory behaviors. Do you feel that, at least in the pediatric population, sometimes hyperactivity and stimming or sensory needs can get intertwined or misunderstood in that way?
Very easily. And we
Mhm,
see that a lot where individuals are labeled as hyperactive because they're hand flapping or because they're rocking. And again, it goes back to, I think, context. When are these behaviors occurring? What's
mhm,
going on? Is this a stressful environment? Is it always present? Is it only present when we're doing specific tasks? Is it only present maybe when we're shifting tasks, right? Those are those triggers for individuals with ASD that are going to cause that type of behavior, the rocking or the stimming, the hand flapping. We get tapping, right? Some way they want sensory input.
mhm,
There's individuals who, my daughter being one of them, who has a weighted vest that helps just give a squeeze. It
mhm,
gives some of that sensory input to help bring them down, to help kind of center them.
mhm.
Um, Whereas someone with ADHD is they're looking to go out. I feel like that sometimes is the difference with ASD versus ADHD. ASD is looking for sensory input for them, and it's
Mhm.
almost like individuals with ADHD are trying to get the input out. They want to be out in the world. They want to move. They want to do, yeah, like you said, they're touching, they're sensory seeking, but it's more to get the energy out than it is to calm themselves down, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
So different functions to this regulatory
To the regular,
behavior.
yep.
So what I'm understanding you saying is that for an autistic individual, they may be feeling quite overwhelmed or quite excited or overstimulated by an environment. And as a result, they utilize more internalized movements such as rocking, flapping. A number of my young people would have like the chewy bracelets or like chewy necklaces, which would really help with that kind of sensory regulation as well, or like a comfort blanket or a special toy that came in the room as well.
Hmm.
And you're right, quite often we see, again, going back to the clinic, young people with ADHD may be getting up, moving around. And it might be that when they're feeling particularly stressed, clothes feeling too tight or too itchy, or but I'm hearing that a lot of this is around context and environment and
Yep.
how this person's needs may then present differently as
Yep.
well. Um, and I'm really curious around language differences as well. And um, I think we see this more in adults, and it's not to detract that adults don't have sensory needs because they absolutely do.
Do.
But when you get to adulthood, you may be like, okay, I know I'm not going to wear like a roll neck jumper because that's going to trigger me. Or I have recognized that if I go into the bathroom and the hand dryer is on in a public place, um, there are more kind of strategies possibly to avoid or have learned behaviors that this doesn't work for me or this can trigger me and overstimulate me. Um, Whereas a young person is kind of learning and navigating that with the
Yeah.
support of adults and teachers around them. And so language does come into that in terms of how we express ourselves.
Right.
And you've already mentioned around the nonverbal communication and how that might be different. But am I right in thinking that there's also differences that we can see between those with those who are diagnosed autistic, those with ADHD, and those who are not diagnosed with either condition and how they communicate?
Yeah, and children with ASD tend to be very literal.
Mhm,
They tend to miss, idioms. There's one of the books in the ADOS-2, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, that's used to diagnose autism, is, pigs flying, and they just can't wrap their heads around it. The pigs don't fly. It's not possible. Like this is so they're very literal in that way, and that they're not able to really break from that normal what is known. So they have difficulties with that type of language. So if you use metaphors, right, or similes with them, they may not understand them, right? And so that can be a language barrier just because they are higher functioning. They have the ability to express themselves. They have language, but the way that we're communicating may not work well with them. And that's where sometimes individuals with ASD, they click, or people that understand how to communicate with them can communicate better because we're speaking their terms. It's almost like me speaking English and someone speaking Swedish, right? If we both try to speak just English and Swedish, we may not understand each other. But if
mhm.
they can speak English, then we can understand each other. Because I
And
can't speak Swedish, I'm stuck. And that's that ASD. They're stuck kind of in this is how my brain works. This is how I hear things. This is how I perceive things. Um, this is my communication style. And then for people with just ADHD, we don't see that lock kind of on language. Um, they typically have, they may have, again, there's other developmental disorders that could be attached to ADHD. You may have someone with a language disorder, a nonverbal disorder that's not ASD, but is ADHD,
mhm,
and that can change how they communicate as well. But for the most part, an individual with quote unquote just ADHD isn't going to have that lock on their language. They're going to be a little bit more adaptable. They're going to be able to understand more complex language and pick up on more nonverbals, perhaps. Than our individuals with ASD. So just like yourself, right? When you're nodding along, I understand that you hear what I'm saying. You're
yeah.
someone with ASD might be like, well, did you hear me? Is that just you said before? Is that right? Was I right? Because they're not picking up on the nonverbal cues, and again, that causes that communication kind of break, which makes it difficult for them, which is another reason why they might withdraw.
Yeah. And on the National Autistic Society website, which is, we use that heavily in the UK, I'm not sure how prevalent it is in the US, we kind of utilize terminology called double empathy. And this is capturing some of those communication style differences, but also thinking about that there's two people in a dialogue. And you've kind of touched on that already in that. Um, if you have two individuals who are neurodivergent, the literature shows that on on average, they will be able to communicate more effectively than when you have someone who is neurodivergent and someone who is neurotypical. That communication can break down on some part because of some of the assumptions from the person who is neurotypical, who does not have any recognized neurodivergence. Um, and there's that difference in communication, and then you find that there's a kind of a two-way disconnect
Hmm.
in terms of how people are both talking and relating as well. Um, and I think also there's the differentiation that we see around kind of going back to that double empathy thing is also how people kind of respond and perceive things as well. And I think there's a common misconception, and I feel you see this more in the adult autistic population, is that there's a bit of a misconception that autistic individuals can't read emotions. They will kind of present as flat, and they're not understanding how they're feeling or how others may be feeling in a situation. And we know that that's not
True.
correct,
Yep.
and we know that uh, we can see that actually some individuals who are autistic can hyper empathize and really take on the emotions of others to the point where it becomes overwhelming and triggers other sensory needs as well, because they're so hypervigilant to the environment. And I think we see that in part with individuals with ADHD can be very empathic and can really want to listen and nurture, particularly if you've had a background where you feel I'm not being heard, people aren't listening to me, that you may really respect those qualities and promote them in yourself. But I think the difference is that in ADHD, it may be that you've moved on or your attention is shifted from that feeling or that conversation. Whereas autistic individuals can really hold on to that and for several days later can really overly identify with
Hmm.
that feeling or that emotion to the point where you would say, hey, you don't seem yourself. What's wrong at the moment? And then it seems like it's hard to identify, but actually it's from a few days back. Have you got much experience of that in your peds clinic?
Yeah, it's that stuck. It's that feeling of being stuck in an emotion or stuck in a place. And that goes into as well with their desire for routine. And when that routine breaks, it's very difficult. So it's very similar in that way. Yes, we may see the flat affect. They may not, again, respond what is considered socially appropriate to your nonverbal cues of you crying, right? Obviously, you're upset. Obviously, you're sad. Something has happened, but they're not able to reciprocate that nonverbal cue does not mean they're not internalizing it, especially in children, again, that magical age of 3 to 7, when we're building these emotional responses, these nonverbals, this teaching them how to empathize, teaching them how to help and be with other people, to reciprocate, you know, they're picking up on those cues. They're just having a hard time processing them. And again, that's where they go, okay, I'm supposed to be sad when Jessica's sad because she's sad, so now I'm sad. And they don't know why because they haven't really fully processed the conversation or what's really going on. They just are they're trying to process the emotion. And
Mhm.
then they get stuck. And then, like you said, it becomes difficult for them to say, why am I upset? And we'd get that sometimes in clinic when we'd bring the child back to the testing rooms. We start working with them and they're just down. They're not wanting to engage. They're very upset. And you try to ask them why, what's going on. And it's again, you're trying to pull back. Where did this really start? Was it because I took you away from your mom? Is it because you had to come to the hospital? Is it because you had to leave school? And all of a sudden it's, well, 6 o'clock in the morning, my brother stole my toy,
Mhm.
and that made me, and now I'm stuck back here. And but it takes a lot of peeling of that onion to find where they're stuck and why are they stuck, and to help them process that to move on, right? And that can be a difficult thing as well. I understand for yourself, working again more with the adult population, but also lifespan, as you said. How have you seen the impacts of trauma? PTSD
Yeah.
with ADHD and autism. As we know, this is a population that isn't always handled well when it comes to traumatic situations or people, again, not being able to communicate properly with someone with autism who experiences trauma that can have long-lasting effects as well. Um, what have you seen around PTSD and trauma relations?
I see, like being a mental health nurse by background, I've seen kind of a lot of trauma in my clinic and working in London and then also in the east of England. A lot of my speciality was around young people, so kind of adolescents, early adults, early adulthood who have been involved in gangs as well. Um, and then some of my later work when working with the adult population who are kind of more embedded, late 30s, mid 40s, who are now considering neurodivergence, trauma crops up again there as well. And so kind of the experience from teens, some of it is around vulnerability, especially when you get the ADHD and autism crossover. Um, some of that vulnerability is taking things at face value. So I've worked with some young people where if they've been approached, can you just take this, not ask any questions and run it to this person over there? Or they're being told that people will like you or
Yeah.
you will earn this amount of status, or even kind of just from it's a way to make money. If you run these drugs or you do this criminal activity, you will get Y. And you're being told by someone who's older than you in a perceived position of power, um, that this is the right thing to do. And sometimes that difficulty around problem solving um, becomes really challenging. Is this the right thing to do? X means Y. Therefore, if you tell me to do this, it will produce this outcome. Some of my young people as well, those more with ADHD, when cannabis gets involved, for self-medication, self-regulation, it can become a bit of a slippery slope, and you can find yourself in traumatic situations linked to either gang violence or violence in the community. And again, going back to autistic individuals who may have misunderstood some of the social undertones when people are exploiting their good nature and asking them to do things which ultimately leads to traumatic situations, or being in a context or an environment which leads to trauma. And unfortunately, that this can also lead, for some of the young people that I've worked with, situations around either sexual abuse or even misunderstandings around consent for sexual interaction, because those interactions feel very complicated and misunderstood around what is consent, what have I implied, what did I mean, versus what does that other person mean as well. And we do a lot as clinicians and try and support a lot with parents around navigating those discussions and those situations. But equally, as we move through life, and you'll be aware as well that we see higher rates of divorce in those individuals with ADHD, and those who are neurodivergent may be more susceptible to things like domestic abuse as well. Um, and so we can get patterns of trauma embedded, unfortunately, whereas the break in routine or the change of environment may feel too much in order to
Break
exit,
free.
those damaging environments. And what really struck me is when I started working more with adults, and I did see predominantly women in my clinic, the amount of reflection and those who had accessed therapeutic services to reflect on previous negative interpersonal relationships or relationships with partners, which had ended up in very challenging situations, seemed really high. Again, where there was miscommunication, arguments had maybe led one step to another, or environments that had ended up quite toxic. Um, so trauma is something that can feel quite obvious, but also people can be significantly affected by the world not feeling like a good fit for them. So even talking to a few of my clients and thinking about just like interactions in the workplace, constantly getting what they perceive as being negative feedback. They're putting in 110%, but they're told, well, if only you could just be a bit more personable in meetings, or maybe you could smile more or be a bit more friendly when you're in the office. And people feeling like, hold on, what am I being measured on here? Work is
Hmm.
for work. Um, and I've frequently heard, especially those coming through later, not getting this kind of negative feedback from peers. And they're like, but I was just being honest. You came to
Yep.
me, you didn't do your work correctly. And again, that what you mentioned earlier around autistic individuals seeing things quite literally at times, and that attention to detail. You've not done this as it was expected. Therefore, I will tell you that this is incorrect.
Hmm.
Um, But also what I noticed a lot, and again, especially in highly intelligent, highly educated individuals who are also neurodivergent, there was then that tendency to take it on themselves.
Right.
I can't trust others with this, or I'm giving them this work to do, but it's not done properly, so I'll do it myself. And the
Mm-hmm.
amount of business owners and high flying people that were working literally over 100 hours a week because they'd ended up an ingrained standard, and then delegating tasks to
Mm-hmm.
others became really challenging. And then you get that burnout, difficulties in relationships at home because you're working, you're tired, you're exhausted. Um, and things seem to go in a bit of a cycle
Um,
from there.
yeah.
Um, I don't know if you've used it in the UK in our kind of CAMS and pediatrics clinic when we were differentiating autism and ADHD. We used something called the Coventry Grid. Have you utilized
I
that
have
in
not.
the US?
I have not heard of that. No.
Oh, it's a really helpful tool where you go through the DSM symptoms of autistic spectrum condition, and it has equivalent examples of a trauma response next to it. So it enables you to work through. Unfortunately, there's not something equivalent for ADHD, but you can go through your assessment and gather information from a parent or caregiver, and the child or young person, um, and then plot it against whether it presents as more trauma, autism, or somewhere in the middle as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what you hit on too with individuals not understanding what they're being judged on. Like you said, individuals with ASD who are giving 110%, they're not seeking the social reciprocity that others seek when we go into the office, right? When we want to communicate with our coworkers, we want to talk with them, we want to smile with them. They're like, I don't need that. I'm good. This is what I'm doing. So again, it's a misunderstanding of neurotypical to ASD, them not understanding what's needed for them to get through their day to day. What do they really need to be quote unquote happy in their work, right? And be supported in their work that way, I think is really important as well because we see that a lot as well in pediatrics, where a child, a high functioning level one, is doing great in school, but has no friends,
Hmm.
or only plays with children that are younger than them, or only wants to hang out with adults because they better intellectually fit better with adults. Socially, they fit better with someone a couple years behind them.
Yeah.
So the focus now goes from, well, yes, you have a 4.0, but why don't you have any friends? And it's like, well, because I don't need friends right now. I'm good. Like it's that misunderstanding of us again, society pushing what we think are societal norms upon individuals who are not neurotypical and don't need the same social input. And again, I think that causes conflict. I think we discussed it before, is when you have multiple people with different neurodivergencies who attempt to communicate. So we know that ASD and ADHD are somewhat linked genetically. There's no hard data just yet, but we do see that trend, especially with ADHD having it tied to genetics. I don't know how many times we had a child come in for ADHD and we're checking off all of the symptoms, and the parents are like, that's that's me. And then also we have a parent in the adult clinic now being tested. Um, so the difficulties of communication, neurodivergent to neurodivergent, and when each person has their own routine or their own needs that we're not able to communicate, I think causes some issues as well, which again leads to, as you said before, an increase in divorce rates or increases in individuals being stuck, being taken advantage of. I thought it was interesting what you said about consent. I think we see that a lot too with adults with ADHD. When we start becoming sexually active, that impulsivity can express itself in many different ways. One of those being with poor decisions around sex, drug use, again, crime, right? Do I really want to steal this car? No, but that guy said it'd be cool. I'm impulsive right now. Let's go steal a car. And that causes those, they don't fully grasp the concept or the consequences of their actions because they're just in the moment with
Hmm.
that impulsivity. And again, it's the others in their lives that are not helping for them to understand, their decisions that they're making, but rather just either forcing them or just letting them do their own thing can be quite devastating as well.
And I think that's when we're in clinic and thinking about differentiating these conditions. I think that that forward thinking and that problem solving is also a way to consider when you've got different conditions presenting in the room. Autistic individuals tend to be able to consider consequences of actions because the impulsivity is lower and that response
Yep.
inhibition is higher. Whereas with ADHD, it can be that kind of after the fact. We've already kind of we've been there, done that, and now we're having to reflect on what's
Hmm.
happened as a result of these behaviors. The other things that I was thinking about, which for me helps me kind of look at whether or not these conditions are presenting together or separately in clinic, um, are things like echolalia and echopraxia.
Hmm.
So we're going back to language with echolalia, but that kind of repetition of words, and I personally notice it more when I'm working with adults and you hear them repeat back phrases from your sentence to it's a way of showing kind of warmth. It's often a kind of a way to just demonstrate listening ability, but you're utilizing the same words. And similarly, echopraxia, the kind of mimicking of movement that you
Hmm.
see. Um, and we see this more when people are utilizing masking or compensatory mechanisms to try and, if they're feeling pressured to fit into societal expectations. And I know that's something that we consider across the lifespan in assessments. And how do you consider echolalia and echopraxia within your ADOS assessment, for example? Are you observing that in the room?
Yeah, that's always one of the things that we're looking for is when we ask a question, are we getting right the answer that we asked for? How are they perceiving the question? Because that does happen a lot of times if I ask you a question and you completely misinterpret it, right? But you're already talking, they're already going, opposed to, as you said, someone with ASD who maybe is a little bit more forward thinking. They're going, I need to listen. Okay, I'm listening. She said, so you said what happens when X? Well, what happens with X is, right? So to them, it becomes kind of that coping skill of I am putting myself in the moment. I am making sure that I not only heard it, but I'm saying it again. So if I heard it incorrectly, she'll
Hmm.
stop me. We see that sometimes again with our older patients, our teens and young adults who understand that social reciprocity and that language reciprocity is very important in having a conversation and being understood and making sure that you're on the same page. Whereas with some of our younger patients, again, it goes back to oh, tell me, do you have any pets? And they start talking about all their pets and all their dogs and and then you go, well, I have a dog too. And they're like, okay. And then they just keep going. They don't loop you into the conversation. So again, it's not that they don't understand the social reciprocity necessarily. It's that they're not seeking it. You asked about mine. I'm going to talk about mine. Um, I heard you say that you have a dog, but that's not a question or an avenue I want to pursue. I'm already over here.
Yeah.
Whereas someone who's maybe a little bit more higher functioning or has had more kind of therapy-based interventions, coping skills, may recognize, okay, I need to stop. What did she say? Oh, you have a dog too. What kind of right? And that triggers that's that break to kind of shift them. And that's a more difficult thing for people with ASD. For people with ADHD, it's very similar in that they'll get rolling, whether it's an inattentive spree where they're kind of bouncing maybe from thing to thing because their train of thought is just kind of chaotic, or impulsive can be do the same thing where they're just kind of bing boom, they're just following the bouncing ball. Um, that language again, echolation can help bring them back. If you get them to refocus, then it helps refocus the conversation. And that's, again, understanding how to communicate with them can help them communicate with us.
just jumping in with what you've said there, because I think there is a key difference that we see, again, when we're thinking about differentiation between autism and ADHD is, and you've highlighted it quite nicely, in that an individual who is autistic may be quite fixed on their own train of thought, and they have got a sequence of things that they would like to speak to you about and are rolling through that sequence in quite nice stepwise fashion. Whereas I think what I personally see with ADHD is that we go off more tangential. So whilst and I know we consider kind of tangential interaction with someone who is autistic, but normally is fixed on a particular topic. With ADHD, it can be, yeah, I went to the cinema with my friends and we saw Twister. And you remember in the original one, there was a cow. And then I went to a farm with my cousin, and my cousin's like 2 and he's out of nursery, and I went to nursery there too. And then he had cool shoes. And then you end up in a very different space to where you started. Whereas with an autistic individual, when you are thinking about how they are kind of in clinic, possibly narrating their own experience, what I find is that they may describe events which are sequential and in an order that feels right for them, but there's also an assumed knowledge. So they might talk about individuals, then I saw Wendy, this, that, and the other. And where an individual with ADHD may say, oh, and by the way, Wendy is my sister. With an autistic individual, they will kind of continue with an assumption that you know who Wendy is. And then when you get that overlap of symptomology, you may sometimes get that darting around, but it's always kind of rolling in the direction, whereas this is the information that I'd like to get out and that I would like to share with you today.
Yeah, it's always interesting talking with individuals with ASD. I feel like you get the full story. As you said, there's assumed knowledge that I know all the players of the play, but they're going to give you everything.
Mm-hmm.
The car ride there, was it raining? Was it sunny? Was it dry? Was it right? How many red lights did they hit? Or right, what the movie theater was, where I sat, right? How many previews that they're going to give you all the information that they perceive to be necessary to tell their story, and it's going to be very linear.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas our individuals with ADHD, we always get that bouncing, and again, it's the same thing when we get an individual with ASD who is stuck in telling or maybe talking about their dedicated topic to get them back to maybe what we were talking about. It's the same thing for someone with ADHD when we're trying to kind of wrangle them back in. And I remember trying to use, just like you said, try to use language or a topic to put it out there for them to hit that and then come back to where we are. So if they're talking about something, they're going, and if I can put something out there that brings them back to where we are, that works. I've used their own little tangents to bring them back to me. Whereas with individuals with ASD, it was almost always like, I understand you want to talk about this topic. I want to talk about something else. If we do this for 5 minutes, then we can go back. Is that okay with you? It's almost like you have to stop them. There's no kind of pulling them slightly over because they're very much on their road. So again,
Mm-hmm.
it's the approach to how do we talk with them? How do I redirect? And the redirect is very different for both groups. And I think that's another way to help differentiate too.
And I think the there's a few bits which we can also pick up on in that clinical setting, and eye contact is one of those as well, isn't it? Which I don't think we've touched on yet. And with an individual with ADHD, we would anticipate, I guess, what we kind of think clinically about, like a regulated eye contact. It's kind of not too intense. You kind of avert your gaze periodically. And you interdisperse that with nonverbal gesturing.
Hmm.
And with those of the autistic community, there may be an awareness that eye contact is expected, but feels incredibly uncomfortable. And I'm sure you've been in a similar
Oh yeah.
situation where the younger ones, which is it's actually really nice to see, because organically they haven't learned what the expectation is yet, so they'll confidently not look at you.
Correct.
and won't respond to their name frequently. Um, but as they become a little bit older, a little bit more aware, and then when, like in the adult population, there's that expectation that even though this feels really uncomfortable for me, you are expecting me to give eye contact. And so you can often feel people possibly looking towards the eyebrows, or they'll tell you, I'm going to look at your shoulder, or I'm going to look at your chin, because that feels more comfortable
Hmm.
for me. Um, and I feel that is also one of those other kind of indicators. And we think about it when we're doing mental state assessments as well, around the kind of quality of eye contact and the intensity of it as well, um, as to whether or not we're looking at autism, ADHD, or a combination of both, where someone's feeling quite restless in their body, they're feeling quite like they need to make eye contact with you, but might then their hyperactivity might pull them into another task, which has the benefit of also breaking that gaze as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the first things on the ADOS is calling their name. So especially with the mod 1 and 2, the younger children, mod 3 is for typically your typical functioning, able to communicate children through teen, whereas mod 1, mod 2 is made for more nonverbal or toddlers. But coming into the room and saying, Jess, hi Jess, do they look at you? Now they may have heard you, they're continuing to play, they're not responding that nonverbal. And so that is an instant. I remember many times working with children with ASD who their eyes were just down the whole time. And again, they weren't bothered by it because yeah, like you said, they're not told yet that they have to make eye contact. So to them, they're just being themselves, and there's
Mhm.
no eye contact. Again, it brings out kind of that flat affect that you're not getting these nonverbal responses. That was always a big differentiation for ADHD. Because as you
Mhm.
said, with individuals with ADHD, that's typically just not present. It's not part of the diagnoses. It's not part of the symptomology of ADHD. So we get normal, quote unquote, normal societal eye contact. As you said, the hyperactivity sometimes, right? Or the inattention, I call it the squirrel moments where they're just like, they're gone, right? That's their way of breaking eye contact. But it still feels more natural.
Mhm.
And then I feel, as we just discussed before, people with ASD sometimes tend to maybe overcompensate. As we said with empathy, they go from not empathizing to understanding, and now we're over empathizing. We got to find same thing with eye contact. They go, okay, I'm maybe 12 to 15 years old. They said eye contact. I'm gonna make eye contact, right? And now, as you said, it's too much. They don't understand the intricacies of it. And like you said, it's almost a healthier level when they get past that to, I understand I'm supposed to look you in the eyes, but I'm gonna look at your nose.
Mhm.
That's where I'm comfortable, right? And so understanding again, being comfortable as themselves and for other people to respect that is what's important for them to feel welcome within the world and to be, again, comfortable just being who they are. And I think that's a big part of properly diagnosing ASD and ADHD, not just for them, but for the people around them. So
Mhm.
other people can better understand, how should I talk to them? How should I interact with them? Is it weird that he won't look me in the eyes? No, it's not quote unquote weird. It is who he is. You're seeking different things than they are. Instead of looking at him as different, how about you just work with him and help give them what they need in the same way that they're going to do their best to give you what you need. Um, and I think that's important, not just again diagnostically, but for society to start becoming more understanding of the neurodivergent population.
I think also as clinicians, we have a responsibility because, again, kind of working with the adult population, um, how does anyone know what the expectation is, especially of things that you do in your personal life? And I think things like sensory needs and food are like a really common one. And you might say, "Oh, like how's your diet?" Yeah, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, no problem. Yeah, and you're like, "Yeah, okay, no problem." But when you drill down into it and you're like, "Okay, can you walk me through what you like to have for breakfast? What's for lunch?" what's for dinner, how do you like that presented, where would you eat, like, and that's when you can kind of drill down further as to, are there any particular textures that you like, are there any colors that you would avoid. And again, where someone with ADHD may have some kind of sensory needs or be seeking out certain sensations if they're feeling particularly stressed or excited, for example, the autistic individuals that we see in clinic can often be more specific in what it is that they like and don't like. So is it texture? Is it, I prefer a beige diet. I like chicken nuggets. I like things plain. I don't like sauces on my food. You can put things on my plate, but it has to be separate. In the UK, we love a roast dinner, and it's part of the assessment is what would you eat for a roast dinner? Where is it on your plate? Do you have an order that you eat it in? If someone offered you gravy or a sauce, what would you say? Um, and you get a lot of nuance out of that. And again, when thinking about our clinicians working with individuals and trying to tease things out, I think the key thing is being curious and asking more questions and getting people to go into detail. Um, and another example pops to mind, which is around like structure and routine. And I had one young woman who really needed the routine. She needed the school day to be school based. Homework was, that was a school task. Why would
Hmm.
I do it at home? I've got my evening routine. And she was autistic, so she liked things to be a set way, but she also had ADHD, and so there was also that drive for newness and some of that dopamine seeking. And she came into clinic, and I was like, "Where is your left eyebrow?" And she was like, "Oh, I just got up and like shaved it off because I was supposed to be sleeping and I couldn't sleep and my body needed something, so I just did it quickly, and then I ran around the garden and then I tried to come back in." And her mum's going, "Yeah, she's doing star jumps on the lawn again because it was supposed to be bedtime. She'd given it 30 minutes. She couldn't get to sleep. And then there was this drive and this impulsivity. And it's
Hmm.
that overlap between, okay, I've done my routine. I've got through the day. Now it's time for sleep. My body's not sleeping. My brain feels on fire. Okay, I'm taking off this eyebrow and I'm doing star jumps in the garden because something feels fizzy and
Hmm.
I'm not sure what to do about it, but kind of what you said earlier, I need to get it out.
Yep.
How do how do I how do I seek newness? How do I get this dopamine hit um now that I'm out of routine? And
Yep.
it's considering those overlaps, I think, as to, does someone seek structure, but do they also need to interdisperse it with impulsive kind of
Hmm.
newness? Are they fixed on things that they like, but still want to move around?
Seek.
They love Lego, but are building a castle, then a crocodile, then a helicopter, and but it's all under the special interest, that kind of
Yep.
thing.
Yeah, it's the routine and the chaos. And the routine is the ASD, right? This is what I'm seeking. This is what helps me feel calm. But the chaos is where I get my dopamine. It's where I get, right, the newness. There's a part of me seeking that. And we've seen too where sometimes that impulsivity causes more anxiety or stress amongst the ASD side of them
Yeah.
because now I don't have a left eyebrow and now I don't know what to do about that because that's very not within my ASD routine. I'm supposed to have two, but impulsive me got rid of one. And so it's that kind of the two sides fighting. It's not, multiple personalities or anything like that, but it's definitely two sides of the same coin constantly seeking control and who's winning. And like you said, I've made it through my day with my routine, but now my brain wants chaos. Well, it's 10 o'clock at night. Is this the time for chaos? And that can cause a lot of problems as well. And again, how do we deal with that? How do parents deal with those two sides of the same child, essentially
Yeah.
trying to wrangle?
And you see that in adults as well, but you also get it in that teen setting. And you mentioned a bit around the impact of impulsivity when you have both diagnoses at play. And that can come up a lot in social situations where um, your ADHD can present as this like outgoing, impulsive, oversharing
Hmm.
character. And you've delivered all of this on a plate to someone that you may not know so well, or there were certain things that you maybe wanted to keep some boundaries around, but have fallen out of your mouth. And then where you have the kind of autistic, possibly overthinking of the social situations or analyzing what happened, then going home and almost amplifying some of that rejection sensitivity. Oh my gosh, I know I wasn't supposed to say that. Uh, what are people thinking about me? How did that come out of my mouth? I didn't
Hmm.
even want to go anyway. I was feeling really overwhelmed and too much. I've had too much time with other people today. I went anyway, and now I've ended up in this situation. And you can get these cycles of anxiety, and it kind of links back into what you asked earlier around trauma in adults. You can see that we have a term like trauma dumping to um, kind of forge relationships, but that can happen when you're feeling quite
Overwhelmed.
socially burnt out and overwhelmed, and the filters go for a moment, but then you're internally dealing with the consequences and that social anxiety of what happens now?
Yep.
What do they think?
And overthinking it too. The thinking that what you said or what you did was the most important thing of the night. It's the one thing everyone's going to remember. It's the one thing everyone's talking about when it maybe wasn't that big of a deal. But again, they're internalizing it. They're going over it. It's almost like the extroverted introvert, the person who, as you said, I know I'm supposed to be here socially. I don't know how to be here socially without just trauma dumping or talking or giving everybody my life story. That's my way of engaging. I'm able to engage if I'm doing these activities, but then at a certain point they hit that wall, they hit that burnout, and they go, I just want to be alone. And now
Mm,
they're cycling through everything that they said. Should I have said that? How did that really sound? Again, if they're also not understanding social reciprocity or nonverbal cues, they're going, how did they take that? How did they understand? Because they don't understand those, right? What were they really getting back from the individual? So again, it causes that anxiety on both ends.
mm,
You have somebody, with ADHD who's maybe anxious about how they're coming off, right? How am my impulsivity is coming through? How is that being perceived? Oh my God, I'm being too much. And then the ASD person who's anxious about not being enough. And again, if we have that comorbid diagnosis, that can be a hard line to walk of trying to find that quote unquote social norm.
yeah.
Where's the middle ground? Because they're constantly living on two ends of a spectrum, and anxious about both of them, and that's not a fun road.
And I'm mindful we could talk about this topic
Of
at
course.
length for hours and hours more, but it sounds like what we're saying is that we can see elements of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention across both conditions. Um, but what we need to do in order to differentiate or understand comorbidity is thinking about context and drilling into detail. Is that hyperactivity a drive, a need to move, or is it a sensory and regulatory repetitive movement? Is this attention looking inattentive because I have a topic that I want to discuss or I want to think about and it's not falling in line with that, versus I have 16 different topics floating around in my mind and I'm jumping between the two, which is more of that ADHD? Or is it impulsivity versus differences in social communication? Have I jumped in and blurted something out that I wish I could put back in my mouth because I've seen everyone's faces and gone, that was an inside thought? That
Hmm.
kind of ADHD side versus the um, kind of social communication differences we see in an autistic individual where you're like, well, I'm going to jump in because this is what I would like to say now. And we haven't picked up on the social cues that it's someone else's time to talk. And I've heard that what we hear for autistic individuals when we're thinking in clinic is we can consider nuances of the diagnosis, which may come alongside ADHD if there's a comorbidity, or alone if it's autism individually. We see echolalia, echopraxia. You want to be looking at the social gaze and social contact. And those kind of cliffhangers in social situations. Does someone respond to a social question when you are trying to lead or follow up on a question that they're already talking about? You also mentioned around transitions and how easy or hard is it for someone to navigate different situations. We've not even got into change, and that's another one, managing change in situations, which I won't bring in now. But it sounds like alongside the neuropsych test, there's a lot that clinicians can observe in clinic around these two conditions, which have high overlap, up to 70%, but have their distinct features in between as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think the biggest differentiating factor becomes the social communication, the nonverbal piece. If that is present, if there were issues, again, ages 3 to 7, right within that developmental period, that we're seeing high comorbidities in terms of developmental or language delays, receptive or expressive, we may be leaning more towards, a pervasive developmental disorder or ASD, whereas ADHD, we're looking at the hyperactivity and attention impulsivity. And then, yeah, we're looking at how does it impact. So looking for that comorbidity. Again, if we have an established ASD and we're adding ADHD, that's a little bit easier because we know what the ASD person's doing. Now we're looking for, do we see these little bits of ADHD? And vice versa. If we have someone who's already been diagnosed, treated with ADHD, now we're looking for the autistic piece. Well, now we're looking for the add-on pieces. But a fresh new diagnosis, yes, neuropsych testing is amazing. It's also expensive. It's also lengthy. But providers being aware of what to look for just within their initial interviews, whether it's a pediatric patient or an adult patient, looking for those nonverbal cues, looking for the eye contact. Again, how is their thought coming out, as we've discussed, right? Change. If I change the topic, how do they handle that, right? Whereas someone with autism may have a more harder time transitioning with change, especially if it's from their routine. Same thing can happen with individuals with ADHD. They may be happy being over here and they don't want to transition. I don't want to sit, and they're going to fight it. But it's a why are they fighting it is going to be different. So I think it's important for clinicians to understand those when just observing their patients. And what are you really looking at? What symptoms are we trying to pull out? And what symptoms are we observing is really important for that comorbidity and that differentiation.
Yeah, so really pulling out the narrative from that individual around their personal experience and their why, the function of
Yep.
their behavior or their needs. Amazing. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate your time today and all of your experience, and
You
I'm
as well.
looking forward to the next discussion. See you
Thank you
later.
so much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.